It's been almost 10 years since I suffered the horrors of being stalked, and I still have nightmares about it. I remember being so bad that I was scared to take a lunch at work because he'd be just waiting in the car for me. I was too scared to even go home sometimes because on more than one occasion, he broke in and waited for me. The cops charged him for breaking and entering, but since it was his first criminal offense, he got away with just nothing but a slap on the wrist. After that, he just got creative and found other ways to psychologically torture me. I go to work and have gifts from him left at my door. I'd see him parked across the street from my house. He called any chance he could and switched up every week or so whenever I blocked a number. SIM cards and burners were just so cheap that he could easily afford to do it. One night, I was sleeping, and he somehow got into the house. I think from the garage. I'll never forget that feeling of waking up to him dragging me across my bed. That messed me up the most. I was terrified and didn't move or say a thing for what happened next. In fact, I'd rather not touch on that at all. Needless to say, after what he did, I went straight to the cops. He backed off for a while but left a flash drive on my doorstep one day. It turned out he filmed what he did to me, but it obscured his face. Let's see. I used to get the conviction because he could hide his face, but he couldn't hide certain distinct features on his body. Then match that up with him being in my apartment, and bingo. He was in prison now for a long time. This was a guy I briefly dated too. I never imagined in a million years on the first date that he'd end up being as evil as he was. But I hear people say that about some serial killers, do other real nice and charming things, until you actually get to know them. The whole ordeal had a really negative effect on my dating life. I still have trouble meeting up with new people, and if the guy acts clingy at all, I just ghost. I have done it to some pretty nice guys, to actual nice guys. I feel like they're trying to track or control me, and I just get all of those feelings of like being trapped, and then I just can't do it anymore.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. This story occurred during the 2017 Christmas holiday. I was living in a city about 700 miles away from where I grew up. Every year for the last 5, I'd return to my parents' home to celebrate the holidays with them. This year would be no different. My job at the time was to provide customer service for a global computer software company based in my state. 5 days a week, I spoke to customers, some furious and some clueless. The call that spawned this mess started like almost any other. The gentleman on the phone had a few questions regarding his warranty. I answered them as well as I could. Once or twice, there was a brief gap in the call as I waited for the computer to give me the information I needed. As you do during periods of silence, the caller began making small talk. I joined in, not thinking anything bad would become that. Over the course of the discussion, he made note of my accent and asked what state I was from. I answered, and it turned out that he lived in that state. Before I knew it, we were discussing our hometowns, and he turned out to live just a town over from the one I grew up in. The entire conversation seemed innocent. When he asked if I ever went back home, I said I did every Christmas. Nothing more was said after that. He thanked me for my help and hung up. The call was so ordinary that I'd forgotten about it by the end of my shift. A few weeks would pass, and I would take a flight back home to celebrate with my parents. The scary part of the story begins here. It was December 23rd, and I was helping my folks put up the tree. Doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, a man had been recognized on the porch. I kindly asked him if I could help. He looked at me puzzled and said something like, "Mike, come on, it's Daryl." These are not her actual names, of course. When I talked to you on the phone, we made plans to hang out. Honestly, I had no idea what this man was talking about. He reminded me, and the discussion slowly came back to me. I did remember some vague talk about us possibly getting together, but no vital information had been shared. I was trying to be nice with you to do strangers with common connections and never had any intention of meeting the guy. Most men understand this silly game, but he obviously didn't. He had me backed into a corner, and I didn't want to be rude, so I made up a story about being needed around the house. This wasn't a complete lie. I suggested we could possibly meet up the next day and ask for his phone number. The answer seemed to please him, and he laughed. I'm ashamed to admit it took me a few hours for the oddity of the situation to hit me. First and foremost, how in God's name did he get my parents' address? I knew for a fact I never gave it to him. I'm still not sure how he got my last name. The creepiness of the situation made me shiver. Now I found myself at a crossroad. Did I call him and ask how he found me? Or do I just ghost him and hope I didn't hear from him again? After a long night of tossing and turning, I chose the latter. Call me worse all you want, but I very much dislike confrontations. This path just sounded easier to me, and it's too bad it didn't work. Christmas Eve arrived, and I planned to spend it with my extended family. Things went well until my phone began to ring around 10:30 that evening. No one I knew would call me that late, so I thought answered with a bit of curt tone in my voice. And Darrow came at me with an attitude from the start. I'm the one that should be mad. We were supposed to go out tonight and you bailed on me. His tone set me off. I told him I never promised him anything, and he shouldn't assume someone would be free to drop everything on Christmas to meet up with a stranger. He began to talk, but I cut him off. I continued by asking how I got my personal information and told him I didn't appreciate him showing up unannounced. You told me your last name when we talked about hanging out. Don't you remember? I just looked up your parents' address in the phone book. I was at a loss for words. I still insist I never gave my last name, but somehow he got it. Him saying I did name even matter. There was no way I was going to let this dude gaslight me. I'd have enough of his games, and as calmly as possible, I told him to never contact me again and hung up. As far as I was concerned, it was over. Only after I calmed down that I began to wonder how he got my cell number. And this made me furious. So furious, I threw my phone against the wall as hard as I could in fury. And now that I think about it, it was probably the right idea. Christmas Day was spent with my parents and went by quite except for one creepy interruption. I'm not sure Daryl was involved, but it's highly likely. In the time we were sitting down for dinner, my parents' home phone rang. My mom answered it and said hello a number of times, but the caller didn't speak. My mom, being busy, shrugged her shoulders and hung up. My guard was up and considered the recent events. I figured it was Daryl trying to intimidate my family. Fortunately, I kept my family out of the business and they thought nothing of it. The subsequent incidents I was expecting never came, and the remainder of my time there went by smoothly. My last encounter with Dara was probably the creepiest of them all. The morning of the 27th was my final day in town. I was scheduled for an 11 a.m. flight. My dad and I were heading out at around 8, and I was standing next to the car to giving my mom one last hug. I happened to glance over my shoulder and caught sight of someone standing behind a tree. They were about 50 yards away, but I could tell it was Daryl. It shocked me, but I was able to hide it from my parents. I insisted my dad we needed to go. There was no way for me to know what he had planned, but I had a hunch my presence was keeping him there, as we passed him a step behind the tree, but the tree was too small to conceal him, and our eyes met one another's, and I could see the hate seething from him. It was honestly one of the most surreal experiences of my entire life. My dad noticed at that point and made a comment about how lonely a crazy person would be out on 27-degree morning, and he had no idea how right he was. The flight home went out without a hitch. I was relieved to be back to somewhere I felt safe. The possibility of Daryl doing something to my parents stayed with me for several months, but things turned out to be just as I thought. I must have been the sole focus of his obsession or whatever you want to call it. There was always the worry that he'd show up in my apartment. but that never materialized, thank God. Work was awkward. With every call I expected to hear at Daryl on the other end, that too never occurred. And now that I'm working and living elsewhere, I'm not as worried. Nonetheless, I'm always aware of my surroundings. You can never be sure when your enemy may decide the time is right to pounce. It may all be a product of an overactive imagination, but I'd rather be safe and sorry. After all, I've got a family to worry about now. I went to beauty school just after high school, so it's just learning what it is like to be an adult work, go to school, and socialize at the same time. If you've ever gone to beauty school, you know the hours are pretty lengthy, and it's a lot of work in a short amount of time. You also know that you're mostly crammed with a lot of women of different ages and a few boys if there's a straight man in school, and he's even mildly attractive, obviously considering you're attracted to that type of person. Most women that score just so at all because it's the only male person we are seeing during most of our weeks. That takes me to Dave. A few years older than me, tall, drives a Ducati to school, mysterious and handsome. Every girl was always putting a little extra makeup, turning their hips towards him, flirting when he was around. He was cute, quiet, and always knew what to say. I was as interested in catching his eye till he randomly asked me to meet up with him for a bite one day after school. I was single, needing to experience dating for the first time, and it didn't seem that bad to hang out with. Things started off very sweet and genuine. He'd sent good night texts, joke with me at school, and even genuinely seemed like he wanted to hang out more and more. We'd go to bars, and he knew everyone, so I could just get right in. I was underage at the time. We go eat, see shows to step drink. I feel like I was starting to feel like an adult enjoying the life and being wooed by a handsome, slightly older man. We drove around on his bike. He'd take me to nice, quiet dinners, always offered to pay, and even didn't little things like hold his arm out when I was walking downstairs or off a curb. I'd never experienced this type of gentleman before. But as quickly as the sweet dates came, so did a very weird, calculated, and controlling behavior. He would start to ask why I didn't smile with my teeth. Was it because I was embarrassed at myself? He would sit behind me working at school and taught me about how slow I was. He'd say things like, "Don't sit like that," or "say things that way. That's not what ladies do, and I'm a lady, right? Don't wear that lipstick, it's trashy." Butts, I guess. Maybe I was being inappropriate. Maybe he's right. I should act more like an adult and a child. Be better at school. Look more like an adult. He brought me to his house one night, a place he rented a room from. Suddenly, this stoic Edward Cullen type turned into a person I didn't recognize. Outside of the random mood shift, his room was filled with clothing and garbage like old Gatorade bottles filling the floors. There was a TV and a bed. Of all the things I could really make out in the room, he brushed dirt off his bed for me to sit down. I hung out for a while, and he oddly confessed he never brushed his teeth. Okay, well, looking at this room, I could believe that. He also mentioned that he just bought new clothes when he needed them and never washed. The dirty ones just left them there. This is all in the first 2 or 3 weeks. Kind of a red flag if you asked me. The lights were off at one point, and we're watching a show, and I see a light like a cell phone right outside the window behind the TV. I jump and get his attention, but he had to have seen. He brushes it off, saying it must be a roommate though. I notice he's texting someone at the same time. Let it go for the night. Eventually go home, but so feel uncomfortable. When the phone calls started happening in the stories of his ex, they lived together. She was 10 years older than him and had a 6-year-old kid. She was crazy. If he and I would hang out, I'd suddenly start getting calls from an unknown number. The minute I walked in my door, they would ring to my voicemail, got them, and no one would say a word till the message ran out of time. They'd happen every 10 minutes for 3 or so hours. I asked him about this, if it was him, and he said it may just be his crazy ex. But how would she have my number? He'd say, well, I have to give her some of her things, and she stole my phone at one point. Must have taken your number. So the gentlemanly dates would happen, and the gifts, sending roses and coffee to my work, showing up with a massage and spa packages every week. We still saw each other at beauty school, almost alien. He'd be kind, but it was always hush-hush until it was outside of school. I was torn. This person lying? Or is this the kind of person to want to date me? Maybe he just has some flaws and a crazy ex. Then the texts and Facebook messages started coming, clarifying it was her. He told me about your messed up life and secrets you've told him. I know he just saw you. I know you were at his house. I was outside his window looking in. Your red dress was nice. He laughs about you. Poor you. Just a stupid little girl. And stuff like that over and over. I block her. Then she'd have friends send me the same BS. She freaked me out, and he always denied it and apologized for her behavior. Then the word Daisy wouldn't show up for school, and he would text me during the day saying they were together, sending pictures of him. I tried to confront him, but he always denied having anything to do with her and repeating that she wanted to ruin his life. And then she started going to my work, telling my coworker she was my friend and would color things on the kids' menu, like my name plus Dave, art, her, and tell them she wanted me to have it. She'd send me a random picture of him in a booth at my work, and I put the pieces together when I got there and got her notes, asking my coworkers where she was sitting and what she looked like. It was gross and embarrassing, let alone scary. My car was broken into at school, and nothing was taken from it, but a bill that had my address on it. Then was so scared. I came home at any point in time, and she started calling me over and over as soon as I closed the door behind me. I felt trapped. She would call my work and school saying she was my mom and try to get more info on me, or call them as a customer saying to get me fired. My roommates finally kicked me out because they were rightfully freaked out. So I turned to the police. They put me in contact with a detective who I handled all of the calls, texts, and messages, plus notes she left in my work. I never answered the phone or responded to a single message from her. I had hundreds of calls, texts for at least a month. They came in every day from the same number. I never blocked that number after the first few were blocked, so I could keep a log of all the attempts. Plus, I have to keep a journal of every incident leading up to me coming to the police just in case. I watched a lot of crime documentaries. He told me that there was nothing he could do to trace the number back to a specific person, and since she hadn't threatened my physical safety, his hands were tied. The very next day, he calls me in, he's furious, telling me he can't help me if I'm harassing her back. I was confused, and when I asked what he meant, he said, "You're calling a mother non-stop throughout the night, terrifying her and her kid." But it was a 20-year-old, and she was 36. Of course he's going to believe the adult, but I never called her. He asked me to come to his office and show me his evidence he has against me. She forged him tons of texts, saying things like, "Well, I can't really say them here, but they were just toxic," which is full of malice, and I just broke down. I would never say some of the things that she had said that I said. And I know I didn't send these tons of texts, especially overnight when I had school the next day. He didn't believe me and completely dismissed me. He ultimately turned against me and was now on her side. And this was crushing. I broke things off for good with David, basically told him to screw off. We still had to go to school together, and he was terrible. I embarrassed myself in front of my friends defending him so long. My work, my school, who I had to beg to make sure this girl didn't come around again, and a detective who ultimately didn't believe a word I said just to get some peace. My friends were tired of seeing me scared, stressed, and constantly talking about this weird situation happening to me. I was over it all. She finally left me alone once I moved, got a new car, a new phone, deleted social media. But it still freaks me out that we all live in the same town. She messaged me a few years ago from a different account when I was back on social media, and said she was sorry that she was manipulated by Dave and that they did this to too many girls. This was disturbing and gut-wrenching to me, to the mother of a 6-year-old, really have nothing better to do than play messed up mind games with a sociopath, maybe 2 sociopaths together.